I had 3 rules for staying alive in that valley. Don't be the loudest voice on the net, don't be the bravest body in the room, and never ever let anyone see the inside of my left forearm. The third rule was the one that mattered. I'd been at the outpost for 6 weeks before the SEAL team showed up, and in those 6 weeks I think I'd said maybe 40 words that weren't strictly necessary. People assumed I was shy. That was fine. Shy is a kind of camouflage, and I had learned to wear it the way I wore my fleece under my body armor, a quiet layer that no one bothered to ask about. My name is Sergeant Nadia Cole. I ran communications for a small infantry company holding a ridge outpost we called the Anvil, up where the mountains stopped pretending to be hills and got serious about it. The air was thin and mean. In the mornings the cold came down off the snow line and got into your hands so deep that you could hold a hot canteen cup and still not feel your fingers for 10 minutes. At night you could hear the wind work its way down the draws, a long low sound like the whole country was breathing out. My job was to sit in the comms hut, a plywood box wrapped in sandbags, and keep the radios alive. I logged traffic, I relayed grid coordinates, I told the boys on the listening posts when their reliefs were coming and listened to them complain when they weren't. It was a small job. I had wanted a small job. I had asked for a small job, specifically the way a man with a bad back asks for a desk. There's a thing people don't tell you about war, which is that most of it is waiting, and most of the waiting is boring, and the boredom is the only part that ever feels safe. I liked the boredom. I liked the static. I liked knowing that the worst thing likely to happen to me on a given day was a dead battery or a soldier with a sob story about his girlfriend back home. So when the helicopters came in low over the eastern ridge that gray afternoon, 2 of them fast and heavy, I felt the boredom go out of the air like heat out of an open door, and I did not like it at all. I stepped out of the comms hut to watch them land. Everybody did. There's nothing to do on a ridge outpost but watch the things that move, and helicopters are about the most exciting thing that ever moves. The rotor wash kicked up a brown wall of grit and we all turned our faces and pulled our collars up, and when it cleared the men were already coming down the ramps. You could tell what they were before you could see their faces. There's a way that certain men move, a kind of economy, like they've measured the distance between where they are and where they want to be and decided exactly how much of themselves to spend getting there. No wasted motion, no talking. They came off the birds in a loose practice spread, weapons up and out, and they took a knee at the edge of the LZ and waited until the helicopters lifted off again before any of them stood. Special operations. SEALs, somebody said, though nobody knew yet why a SEAL element was being dropped onto an army infantry outpost in the middle of nowhere. They had their own air, their own gear, their own quiet. They didn't need us. That was clear from the start. They needed our ridge, our fuel, and a place to stage out of for a few days, and they would have preferred, I think, that we simply not exist. I felt the same way about them. I turned to go back into the hut. That should have been the end of it. If I had been a half-second faster, if I hadn't paused to glance back the way you do at any large, dangerous thing that has just landed in your yard, I think the rest of it would never have happened and I would still be invisible, and 3 people I came to care about would be names I never knew. But I did pause, and one of them was looking at me. He was older than the rest, maybe 40, with gray salted into the stubble on his jaw and a way of standing that was somehow both relaxed and absolutely awake. The others deferred to him without seeming to, the way water bends around a rock. I learned later he was a master chief, the senior enlisted man on the team, a man named Wade Cormack who had been doing this kind of work for longer than some of his operators had been alive. But in that moment I didn't know any of that. I just knew that he was looking at me, and I had spent 6 weeks making absolutely sure that nobody looked at me, and I had failed. I went inside. The first night they kept to themselves, which suited everyone. They set up in the empty half of the supply bunker, ran their own little planning cell with maps I wasn't allowed to see, and ate their own food. I caught fragments on the radio net I was running, encrypted call signs that weren't ours, traffic I logged but couldn't read. Something was being planned up in the high country to our north, past the Anvil, into a notch in the mountains the maps just called the Saddle. I didn't think about the Saddle. I had trained myself over a long time and at great cost not to think about certain pieces of ground, and the Saddle was one of them. I should explain about the tattoo now, because everything that comes after is really about the tattoo, and you should understand it the way I understand it, which is not the way it looks. Small, on the inside of my left forearm where the skin is pale, there are 3 little black mountain peaks in a row, simple, almost like a child drew them. Above the middle peak there's a single 5-pointed star, and under the peaks, in numbers so small you'd have to be close to read them, there's a set of grid coordinates and a date. The date is 4 years and some months before that gray afternoon. The coordinates are the Saddle. I'll tell you about that later. I have to for the story to mean anything, but I couldn't have told you about it then. Then I kept my sleeves down and my arm turned in, and I would have sooner stripped naked in the chow line than let a stranger read those numbers. The second day, Cormac came to the comms hut. I heard the door scrape and I knew it was him before I turned around, the way you know a particular footstep, though I'd never heard his. He filled the doorway and didn't come all the way in. He had a folded map and a question about our relay frequencies for the high ground technical stuff, and I answered him without looking up, professional and short, the way I answered everyone. "You're good on the net," he said, calm. "It's a calm job," I said. He didn't leave. I felt him standing there, and I felt the old animal part of my brain start to whine, the part that knows when something is about to be seen. I reached for my coffee, and that was the mistake, because reaching for the coffee turned my arm and my sleeve had ridden up at the wrist in the cold, and his eyes went to it and stopped. I have watched a lot of faces in my life. I have learned to read them because for a long time my survival depended on it. And I watched Wade Cormac's face do something I had only ever seen a few times, which was the thing a face does when it recognizes something it has no business recognizing. He didn't say anything right away. He looked at the three peaks and the star and the small numbers underneath, and the color went out from under his tan, and his jaw worked once like he was chewing on a word that didn't want to come out. "Where'd you get that?" he said. It wasn't really a question. His voice had gone very flat and very careful, the voice of a man walking on ice he isn't sure will hold. "It's just a tattoo," I said, and pulled my sleeve down. "Those are coordinates," he said it quietly. "Those peaks, the star, that's not a design. Somebody who's never been there draws three peaks and you can't tell one valley from another, but somebody who was there draws those three peaks." He stopped. "I've seen that exact mark one other time in my life." The radio crackled with routine traffic, and I answered it on autopilot, glad of the excuse. And when I set the handset down, he was still standing there, and his eyes had gone wet at the edges in a way that a man like that does not let happen by accident. "Where?" I made myself ask, because not asking would have been worse. "On my brother," he said. "On the inside of his left arm, three peaks, a star, the saddle, and the date he almost died there." He took a breath. "He's the only other person I ever met who had that, and he told me there was one more, a girl on the team that pulled him out. He said she carried the same mark because she'd carried him." The hut was very small and very cold and very quiet, and the static hissed, and I understood that the 6 weeks were over, and the 4 years were over, and the careful, invisible little life I had built out of plywood and radio frequencies was over too. I'd built it well. But you cannot build a wall high enough to keep out a man whose brother you carried down a mountain. "His name was Danny." I said. It came out before I decided to say it. "Petty Officer Daniel Cormac." And the Master Chief put one hand against the door frame like the floor had moved, and he said, in a voice I will hear for the rest of my life, "You're her. You're the one who stayed with him." I need to back up now. I need to tell you about the saddle, because you can't understand what happened on that ridge over the next 3 days without understanding the ridge 4 years before it, and the 3 peaks, and why a comms sergeant had a tattoo a Navy SEAL recognized from his dead brother's arm. But let me first finish the moment, because moments like that don't end clean. I didn't fall apart, I want you to know that. I had imagined, in 4 years of not thinking about it, that if this ever happened I would come undone, and I didn't. What I felt was stranger and quieter than that. I felt the thing I'd been carrying shift, like a pack you've worn so long you've forgotten it's there, until somebody touches it and the whole weight of it comes back into your shoulders all at once. "Sit down, Master Chief," I said, "before you fall down." He sat on the spare ammo can I kept for visitors who never came. He was a big man and the can was small, and he didn't care. He looked at me the way you look at a door you've been knocking on for years that has finally opened, half hope and half terror about what's on the other side. "They told me," he said slowly, "that he didn't die alone. The after action, the guys who debriefed it. They said somebody from the team stayed with him through the worst of it, kept working on him while they took fire, refused to leave him on the rock. They never gave me a name. It was a different unit, a different command, half of it was classified, and the one I really wanted to talk to had transferred out and gone dark. Reassigned. Disappeared into the army," somebody said. "I looked for 2 years and I quit looking," he swallowed. "And here you are running radios on a ridge in the middle of nowhere." "Here I am," I said. "Why'd you disappear?" And that is the question, isn't it? That is the whole question. I didn't answer it then. I couldn't, not standing in a plywood box with the net live and his men 200 meters away planning to walk into the exact terrain that had taken his brother and 3 others and very nearly taken me. There wasn't room in that moment for the answer. The answer needed the whole story. But I'll give it to you now before I give it to him because you've earned it by listening this far and he had to earn it the hard way. I disappeared because I lived. 4 years before the anvil, I wasn't a comms sergeant. I was attached as the intelligence and communications element to a small recon team operating out of a base I won't name, in country I'd been in long enough to dream in the local language. I wasn't a SEAL. I wasn't special operations in the way the men were, but I'd trained hard to be useful to men like them and I was good, and they had stopped seeing the line between us a long time before that night. I carried what they carried and I climbed what they climbed, and when the shooting started I did my part, and they trusted me, and that trust was the best thing I had ever earned in my life. There were 8 of us who went up to the saddle, there were 5 who came down. The mission doesn't matter now. It mattered enormously then, the way they all do, and most of it is still locked up in a vault somewhere and none of it would mean anything to you. What matters is the ground. The saddle is a notch high between 2 peaks, a low pass with a spine of bare rock running through the middle of it, and on either side the mountain falls away into draws choked with scrub and loose stone. It is a beautiful, terrible place. From the top you can see for 50 miles. From the draws, men with rifles can see you and you cannot see them. We went up at night and we were supposed to be gone before light. We weren't. I won't tell you whose fault that was because it wasn't anyone's fault, it was just the way these things go wrong. A delay here and a piece of bad luck there, and the gray started coming up in the east and we were still on the spine, exposed, and the first shot came in before anyone had time to be afraid. After that it was just noise and rock and the smell of it, cordite and dust and blood, all the things they tell you about and none of it the way they tell you. The radio was in my hands. That was my place in the fight, the net calling it in, talking to the aircraft that were too far and the artillery that was too slow and the command that wanted to know things I had no time to tell them. I remember my own voice on the net steady while the rest of me was screaming. I remember thinking, keep your voice flat. If your voice is flat, the men hear it and they think someone is in control, and if they think someone is in control they keep working, and if they keep working some of them live. Danny Cormack went down maybe 20 minutes in. He was the youngest of us, younger than me even, with a way of grinning at the worst possible moments that made you want to grin back and slap him at the same time. He took a round high in the chest and another low, and he went down behind a hump of rock at the forward edge of our little island in the open, and the man next to him couldn't reach him without crossing the open spine, and the fire across that spine was a solid thing, a wall, you could feel the air of it. I crossed it. I'm not telling you that to sound brave. I have thought about it 1,000 times and I genuinely do not know why I did it. I was the comms element. My job was the net was the most valuable thing on that rock, and the smart thing, the train thing, the thing I should have done was to keep talking on the radio and let the assault element handle their own wounded. But Danny was looking at me. Across all that fire he had turned his head and he was looking right at me and his mouth was moving, and I could not hear him and I knew exactly what he was saying anyway, which was the thing they all say, which is don't leave me. So I handed the net to the team leader and I went across. I don't remember the crossing. There's a blank there. The next thing I have is being behind the rock with Danny, with my hands inside his gear trying to find the holes, and his blood was so hot and there was so much of it and he kept trying to talk and I kept telling him to shut up and save his air. The team leader was on the net behind me now and the aircraft were finally coming and someone was screaming for the medevac, and I was working on Danny with the small inadequate tools we carry and the enormous inadequate hope that any of it would matter. He knew, I think. He was 19 and he knew. There's a clarity that comes over the badly hurt sometimes, a terrible calm, and it came over him and he stopped trying to talk loud and started trying to talk quiet just to me with his hand gripping my wrist. He told me about his brother. He told me Wade was a SEAL too, a real hard case, the one who'd gotten him into all this, the one he'd followed into the Navy and into the teams because he wanted to be like him. He told me Wade was going to be so angry at him for getting shot. He said it like a joke and then it wasn't a joke. He asked me to tell Wade something and I leaned down close to hear it over the noise and he told me, and I have kept it for 4 years, and I have not said it to a single living soul because the one person it belonged to had disappeared from me as completely as I had tried to disappear from the world. He died about 90 seconds before the gunships finally beat the draws into silence. His hand was still on my wrist, I had to take it off myself. We lost 2 more on the way out. We carried the bodies, you do not leave them. I helped carry Danny down off that mountain with the gray light coming up full now and the cold sweat freezing on me, and somewhere in the carrying I made a decision I didn't know I was making, which was that I was done. Not done with the army, done with mattering, done with being someone whose choices decided who lived. Because I had made a choice on that spine, I had left the net and crossed the open, and a part of me would always believe that if I'd stayed on the radio I could have brought the aircraft in faster and maybe one of the three would still be alive. There's no answer to that, there's no way to know, but you don't need to know a thing for it to ruin you. So when I rotated home I asked for the smallest job in the army. And I got it. And I got the tattoo, the 3 peaks for the 3 we lost and the star for Danny in the middle because he was the one I held, and the coordinates and the date so I would never be able to lie to myself about where I'd been, and then I pulled my sleeve down and I disappeared. For 4 years it worked. It stopped working in a plywood hut on the anvil when Wade Cormack saw his brother's mark on my arm. I didn't tell him all of that in the hut, I told him enough. I told him I'd been on the team, I told him I was the one who stayed. I didn't tell him what Danny said, not yet, because I am a coward about the things that matter most and because his men were about to walk into the saddle and there was no time. That was the part that finally broke through my numbness. The mission. I'd logged the traffic and refused to read it, but now I made myself ask and Cormac told me because the thing between us had become bigger than classification. They were going up to the saddle. A high-value target was moving through the notch in the next 72 hours, intelligence said, and his team was going to set in on the high ground above the pass and take him when he came through. They had the imagery and the overheads and the analysts' confidence. What they didn't have was anyone who had ever stood on that spine while men in the draws tried to kill them. I know that ground, I said. The words felt strange coming out like a language I used to speak. I know it in the dark. I know where the draws funnel and where the dead space is and where a man thinks he's covered and isn't. I know where we got hit and why, and I have spent 4 years not thinking about a single inch of it, and I can draw it for you with my eyes closed. Cormac looked at me for a long moment. Then I want you to draw it for us, he said, and then I want you to come up with us. I said no. I said no so fast and so hard that it surprised both of us. Every cell in my body said no. Going back up to the saddle was the one thing I had built my whole quiet life to never do. I had a job, I had the net. I had my plywood and my static and my 40 words. I was invisible and invisible was safe and safe was the only thing I had left. I'm comms, I said. I'm not your operator, I'd be a liability up there. You don't take a stranger on a target package, you know that, that's basic. You're not a stranger, he said. You've been on that spine, none of my guys have. You're the most valuable person on this outpost for this mission and you know it, and you're saying no because you're scared, and that's allowed, but don't dress it up as tactics. He stood. He was gentle about it, which was worse than if he'd been hard. I'm not going to order you, it wouldn't even be my call to order you, I'm asking you. Help me bring my guys home off the same rock that took my brother. And there it was, the thing I'd been running from for 4 years set down in front of me, simple and impossible. I told him I'd think about it. I drew the ground for him that night in the planning cell by the light of a single bulb, and I watched the operators lean in over my hasty map, and I saw the moment each of them understood that the imagery had lied to them, that the draw the analysts thought was covered was a kill funnel, that the spot they'd picked to set in was the exact spot we'd been pinned in, that the dead space they thought would protect their exfil was the place I had carried a dying boy through with his blood freezing on my hands. I drew them the truth of the ground and I watched it save their plan before they ever set a boot on it, and somewhere in the drawing of it I understood that I was going. We went up at night the way you do, 8 of us again, I noticed that, 8 up. I did not say anything about it, but Cormac caught my face when we staged at the wire and he knew what I was counting and he put a hand on my shoulder for 1 second hard and that was all and it was enough. The cold was the same. That's the thing that got me, climbing in the dark with the team strung out ahead and behind. The cold was exactly the same, the way it came up off the snow line and into your hands, the way the wind worked the draws with that long low breathing sound. The body remembers what the mind tries to bury. My feet found the rocks before my eyes did. I knew where the trail pinched and where it opened. I led from the middle of the file, calling the ground in a whisper over the net, and the operators followed a comms sergeant up a mountain in the dark because she knew the dark better than they did, and I felt the old thing come back into me, the usefulness, the trust, the terrible good feeling of mattering. We set in before light on the high ground above the saddle, not where the analysts wanted but where I told them, 50 meters off and on the right side of a spine of rock that gave us eyes on the notch and cover from the draws. I tucked into a crevice with a radio, back in my place, the net in my hands. It felt like coming home to a house where someone had died. And then we waited. War is mostly waiting, and the waiting was the worst part, lying in the rocks in the cold with the gray starting to think about coming up in the east, knowing this was the exact hour, almost to the minute, that it had all gone wrong 4 years before. I lay there and I shook and it wasn't the cold. Cormac was 3 meters away. I could hear him breathing slow and even an old hand managing his own fear by managing his breath, and I matched my breathing to his without meaning to, and it helped. The target came through near first light just like the intelligence said, a small group moving fast up through the notch. The team did what teams do. It was quick and it was controlled and it was, for about 90 seconds, exactly the clean operation everyone had hoped for. Then the draws woke up. I told them it would happen and I had still hoped I was wrong. There were more guns in those draws than anyone's imagery had shown, a security element that had been sitting in the dead space the analysts swore didn't exist. And the first long burst came up out of the scrub and walked across the rocks and the air turned solid again, that wall I remembered, and one of our men went down. It was Petty Officer Reyes, a young one, shot through the leg, down in the open between two slabs of rock with the fire building between him and the rest of us. And I watched it happen the way you watch a thing you have already seen, because I had seen it, I had seen this exact thing, a young man down in the open and the wall of fire between him and the people who loved him. And I knew with absolute certainty what came next, which was that somebody was going to cross that open ground for him and there was a good chance they would not come back. The difference was that this time I knew the ground. "Hold," I said on the net, and my voice came out flat, that old flat voice, and I heard the team leader pause because the comms sergeant had just given a command and it had landed like one. "There's dead space, 6 meters left of Reyes behind the low slab. The guns in the south draw can't make that angle, I've stood right there, they can't see it. Reyes, can you hear me? You crawl left, not back, left, 6 meters behind the slab, do it now." And Reyes, bless him, a kid I'd met 2 days before, trusted the voice on the net the way men trust the voice that stays flat, and he dragged himself left instead of back, into the dead space I knew was there because 4 years ago it was the only reason any of us got off that rock alive, and the fire that should have killed him chewed empty stone. I got the gunships in. That was my job and I did it the way I should have done it 4 years ago, fast and clean, talking them onto the draws with the grid memorized in my own skin, and they came in low and beat the scrub into silence the way their brothers had once come too late, and this time it was not too late. We got Reyes out, we got everyone out, 8 up, 8 down. I counted them at the bottom twice and the second time Cormac watched me count and his face did something complicated and he didn't say anything and I didn't say anything and we both knew. We talked that night, after the medevac took Reyes and the adrenaline had drained out and left us hollow the way it does. We sat outside the comms hut with our backs against the sandbags and the cold coming down and the stars enormous and indifferent overhead, and I finally told him the thing I'd been carrying for 4 years. I told him what Danny said. I won't write it all here. Some of it belonged only to the 2 of them brothers and I gave it to Wade and it stopped belonging to me, but I'll tell you the shape of it. Danny wasn't scared at the end. He told me to tell Wade that he wasn't scared, which was a lie, but it was the kind of lie a younger brother tells so an older brother can sleep. He told me he didn't blame Wade for getting him into the teams, that it was the best thing he'd ever done, that he'd do it again. He told me to tell Wade to stop carrying things, and then, right at the end with his hand on my wrist, he made me promise that I'd be the one to find Wade and say it, because he didn't want it coming through some chaplain or some form letter, he wanted it to come from the person who was there. And I had broken that promise for 4 years. I had disappeared specifically so I would never have to keep it, because keeping it meant going back into the world of men who mattered and choices that killed, and I couldn't. I told Wade that. I told him I'd run from his brother's last words because I was a coward, and I waited for him to hate me because I had hated myself for it for a long time. He didn't hate me. He was quiet for a while, the wind worked the draws, and then he said the thing that I think finally let me set the pack down. He said, "You crossed the open for him, you stayed when you could have run, you carried him down a mountain, and you've spent 4 years calling yourself a coward." He shook his head slow in the dark. "Nadia, the cowardly thing would have been easy. You did the hard thing on the rock and then you spent 4 years too gutted to do the easy part, which was talk to me. That's not cowardice. That's a wound, there's a difference, and somebody should have told you a long time ago." I cried then. I'm not ashamed of it. I'd held it for 4 years and it came out all at once in the cold, and Wade Cormac put one arm around my shoulders the way you do for one of your own, and we sat there, 2 people who had both been broken by the same piece of high ground, and we let it be broken together for a while, and somehow that made it lighter than carrying it alone. I don't run comms in a plywood box anymore. I went back to the work I'd run from, the real work, because Wade was right. The hiding was the wound and not the cure, and the only way I ever found to heal a thing was to walk back into the place it happened, and do the hard part I'd skipped. People ask me sometimes about the tattoo. New people who don't know, 3 peaks, a star, some numbers, they think it's just a design. I used to pull my sleeve down, I don't anymore. I tell them it's 3 friends and a place and a date, and most of them have the grace not to ask more, and the ones who do ask I tell. Because I learned something on that ridge the second time that I wish I'd known the first. I spent 4 years believing the way to survive what happened was to make myself small, to stay invisible, to never matter to anyone again so that no one's life could ever depend on a choice I made. And the whole time I had it exactly backward. Being invisible didn't keep anyone safe, it just kept me alone with the weight. The thing that finally lifted it wasn't hiding. It was being seen by the one person who'd been carrying the same stone from the same mountain, and finding out that the weight gets lighter the moment somebody else puts their hands under it. Danny told me to tell his brother to stop carrying things. It took me 4 years and a second trip up the saddle to understand that the message was for me too. I keep the sleeve up now, let them see it. The mark isn't a thing to hide, it's 3 peaks and a star and a place I went and came back from twice, and the second time I brought everyone home. That's not a wound anymore, that's just where I've been. And I'm not invisible anymore, I decided I'd rather be seen. I was good at the radio, I'm not bragging when I say that. It was the one thing I knew I was good at, and I held onto it the way you hold onto a railing in the dark. The radio is a strange skill. It's calm under pressure mostly. It's the ability to keep your voice flat and your words short while everything inside you is screaming. It's knowing that the man on the other end can't see you, can only hear you, and that your voice is the only thing he has, so it had better not shake. Brunner couldn't stand it. Couldn't stand that the new girl, the kid, the school bus joke, was the one Okonkwo wanted next to him during a radio check. So he did what men like him do, he chipped. It started small. He'd borrow my gear and not give it back. He'd send me to the far tower with a load of water in the worst heat of the day for no reason anyone could name. He started a thing where he'd call me Princess Comms, and the younger guys picked it up because it was easier than not picking it up. When I'd report something on the net, a glint of metal on a ridge, a vehicle that had been sitting too long in the same spot, he'd key over me or wave it off or say loud enough for the tent to hear, "She sees ghosts. Girls never been shot at, everything's a ghost." The thing about that kind of treatment is that it works on you even when you know it's nonsense. You start checking yourself. You start wondering if maybe you do see ghosts. You start staying quiet about the glint of metal because the cost of being wrong in front of Brunner is worse than the cost of being right and ignored. That's the real damage, not the names. The names just bruise. The damage is the way it makes you smaller, the way it teaches you to swallow the very thing that might keep everyone alive. Tomlin was the one who told me to keep talking on the net anyway. Eli Tomlin was 20, from somewhere in the middle of the country with a lot of corn in it, and he had a laugh that didn't fit a war. He'd taken to eating chow next to me, partly out of kindness and partly, I think, because the other guys had started treating me like a curse you didn't want to catch by association, and Tomlin had decided he didn't care. He had a picture of a girl back home folded so many times the creases had gone soft and white. He showed it to me once, embarrassed, and I told him she was pretty, which she was, and he grinned like I'd handed him a medal. "Don't let Brunner shut you up," he said one night in the tower. The valley was green in the scope, and the cold was the kind that gets into your teeth. "You called that motorcycle 2 days ago, the one that did 3 passes on the road. I heard it. He blew you off, and then it turned up in the brief from battalion like it was their idea." "He doesn't think I belong here," I said. Tomlin was quiet for a while, then he said something I've never forgotten. "Brunner doesn't think anybody belongs here who makes him look slow. That's not about you, that's about him, but the radio's about all of us, so keep talking." I kept talking, quieter than I should have, but I kept talking. The day it all came apart started like every other day, which is the part nobody believes when I tell it. There was no warning. The sky didn't darken. The wind didn't change. It was just a hot, ordinary day, and we'd been at Ironwood long enough that ordinary had started to feel like safety, which is the most dangerous feeling there is out there. A patrol had gone out at first light. Sergeant Reyes had taken a team of 6 down into the valley to walk the road and check a culvert that intel said somebody had been digging near at night. Standard. They'd done it a dozen times. I was on the radio in the operations center, logging their checkpoints as they called them in, their voices crackling and far away and bored, because that's what most of war is, bored men reading off grid coordinates while the sun climbs. Around 11, Okonkwo rotated the inner positions and sent half of us to chow before the worst of the heat. The chow tent was crowded, loud, the smell of reconstituted eggs and burnt coffee and unwashed men, the good loud, the human loud I'd missed my first night. I got my tray and found a corner. Brunner sat down across from me. He didn't have to, there were other seats. He chose mine the way a cat chooses the lap of the one person allergic to it. "Big day, princess," he said. "You log any ghosts this morning, or were they letting you nap?" Patrol's still out, I said. I kept my eyes on my tray. Rays is at the culvert. Rays is at the culvert, he repeated in a high mocking voice that was supposed to be mine and sounded nothing like me. A couple of the guys snickered. Tomlin, 2 seats down, didn't. You know what your problem is, Quint? You think the radio makes you a Marine. It doesn't. You ever even seen a man bleed? You ever had to do anything but talk? I felt my face get hot. I hated that it did. I hated that 13 months and a comms course and the second highest score in my class could be erased by one big sunburned man in a chow tent, and that some animal part of me still wanted his approval, still flinched at his voice. I do my job, I said. You do your job, he echoed and reached across and flicked the rim of my tray so my egg slid into my coffee. Small, stupid. The kind of thing a boy does in a cafeteria. The whole tent saw it and the whole tent laughed, and I sat there with ruined eggs and a face full of heat and the radio chatter still running soft in my earpiece because I never took it out, not at chow, not in the head, not ever. And that's the thing, that's the whole hinge of it. While Brunner was flicking my tray and the tent was laughing, I was the only person in that tent still listening to the net. Which is how I heard Ray's voice change. There's a sound a man makes on the radio right before everything goes wrong, and once you've heard it you never mistake it for anything else. It isn't a scream, screaming comes later, it's a flatness. A sudden careful slowness like a man walking on ice, choosing each word because he's just realized the ground he's standing on might not hold. Ironwood, this is Ray's. A pause that lasted half a second and felt like an hour. We've got stand by. The tent was still laughing about my eggs. Brunner was still grinning, soaking it in. I had a hand up before I'd decided to raise it. Quiet, I said. It came out small. Nobody heard me. The laughter rolled on. Quiet, louder this time, loud enough that it cracked and the nearest faces turned, more surprised that the new girl had a voice than at anything she'd said with it. Then the net opened up and the whole tent heard it through my earpiece because I'd already torn it out and was holding it up. And even tinny and small, the words filled the space and killed the laughter dead. Contact, contact, troops in contact, multiple firing positions, we are pinned in the culvert, we have casualties. Ray's voice was swallowed by a roar of static that was gunfire, real gunfire, the flat hard cracking that the radio turns into a kind of tearing sound. Need QRF, need it now, we are pinned, I have a man down. I was already moving, tray on the floor, eggs and coffee everywhere, and I didn't notice and didn't care. The operations center was 40 yards away and I covered it without remembering my feet touching the ground. The duty radio man, a kid named Birdie, was sitting there frozen with his mouth open, and I shoved him beside him and keyed the handset and my voice came out of me flat and slow and steady, the exact opposite of everything happening in my chest. Rays, Ironwood, I have you, send your situation, slow, I've got you. It is a strange thing, courage. Mine never felt like courage. It felt like falling into the one place where I knew the floor. The valley could be on fire and I would still know how to talk on a radio, and that knowing was the only solid thing in the world right then, so I stood on it. Rays, send me your grid and your casualties. He gave them to me. 1 man hit, leg bleeding bad, 6 of them pinned in a dry culvert with men firing down from 2 compounds and a tree line. They could not move. Every time they tried, the fire walked across them. They needed the quick reaction force and they needed it in minutes, not in the long, lazy hour of an ordinary war. Okonkwo came through the door of the ops center at a dead run. He'd heard the towers go to alert, heard the first guns. Behind him the whole outpost was coming alive, men grabbing weapons and vests, the QRF truck coughing and starting, dust everywhere. Okonkwo's eyes found me at the radio and something passed between us fast, no words. He nodded once. Stay, talk, be the voice. Quint, you're the net, he said. You don't leave that handset, you are Ray's lifeline and you are mine, understand? Roger, Sergeant. He grabbed Brunner by the shoulder strap as he ran past Brunner, who'd been at the door, who was QRF that day, who was supposed to be the experienced one, the calm one, the 100 push-up man. Brunner, you're on the gun, you and Tomlin and Vasquez, you're rolling. Move. And here is where I tell you the thing that I have turned over in my mind 10,000 times, the thing that's the whole reason I'm telling you any of this. Because up to that minute the story was the one everybody knows. Big tough Marine, small quiet girl, cafeteria cruelty. And if the day had ended at the chow tent, that's the story it would have stayed. But war doesn't care about the stories we build in chow tents. War walks in and asks one question, and the question is not how much can you bench or how loud can you mock. The question is, when the floor drops out, what are you? The QRF truck rolled out the gate with Brunner up top behind the heavy gun, Tomlin and Vasquez and Birdie inside, and a driver named Kemp who I'd barely spoken to. I tracked them on the net, calling their movement to Ray's, calling Ray's situation back to them, the bridge between two groups of men who couldn't see each other through the dust and the terrain. My voice was the road between them. QRF, Ray's is in the culvert south of your route. You'll see the smoke. Fire is coming from the two-story compound on your left and the tree line beyond it. Ray's, QRF is 2 minutes out. Hold on, I've got you. I had them all in my head like points of light. The truck, the culvert, the compound, the tree line, the wounded man bleeding into the dirt who turned out to be a kid named Doyle with a wife and a baby he'd never met. I held all of it and I kept my voice flat. Then the truck reached the contact and Brunner opened up with the heavy gun, and for about 30 seconds it sounded like we were winning. The volume of fire from a .50 caliber is its own kind of weather. You can hear it change the air. The men in the culvert felt the enemy fire slacken as the compound took rounds, and Ray's voice came up with hope in it for the first time, telling me they were going to move, going to get Doyle out. And then Brunner made his mistake. I want to be careful here because this is the part where it would be easy to make him a monster, and he wasn't a monster. He was a frightened man who had spent so long performing courage that he had never once practiced it, and the two are not the same, and the day you find out they're not the same is the worst day of your life. I think that day was his. There was a second element in the valley that morning. A small foot patrol, 3 men under a corporal named Hutchins that had gone out the back gate before dawn to sit on a piece of high ground and watch the road in overwatch position. They'd been there for hours. They were hours. And when the contact kicked off and the QRF came roaring down the road, Hutchins moved his 3 men off the high ground to flank the compound, to help, exactly like he was supposed to. They came down through a wadi to the south, on foot, low and fast. Brunner saw movement on his left, men low, moving toward the fight. In the dust and the chaos and the roar of his own gun and the fear that he would never have admitted was fear, he did not do the one thing every Marine is taught until it's carved into bone. He did not get positive identification. He did not ask the net. He did not check. He swung the heavy gun toward the movement in the wadi and he fired. I heard it happen because I heard everything. I heard the .50 change direction. You can hear it, the rhythm shifts. And in the same instant I heard Hutchins's voice come up on the net, a voice I'd been tracking too, because that's what a radio operator does. You hold all the threads. Hutchins screaming, "Ceasefire, ceasefire, friendlies in the wadi, that's US, ceasefire." I keyed the gun truck's frequency and I did not let my voice rise even 1 degree, because I knew in my body that a shouting voice would be lost in the noise, but a flat, hard, clear one might cut through. QRF, ceasefire, ceasefire, those are friendlies. Hutchins's element is in the wadi south of you, ceasefire. There was half a second of nothing, the longest half second of my life. The .50 was still going. Brunner, ceasefire! I said his name. I'd never once given him an order, never dared, the school bus joke, the princess, the kid, but I said his name into that handset like I was throwing it, and somewhere out in the valley it landed and the gun stopped. The silence after was its own sound. Then Hutchins's voice ragged, "We've got a man hit, friendly fire, we've got a man down, gunshot wound, it's bad." It was one of his 3, a lance corporal named Pratt. The rounds had walked across the wadi and caught him in the side before the gun came off them. And the thing that happened next is the thing that broke whatever was left of Dale Brunner, the thing that I had a front row seat to even though I was 40 yards behind a plywood wall because I could hear it all. Brunner froze. He didn't get down off the gun and help. He didn't direct fire. He didn't do anything. The voice that came up next on the net was not his, it was Tomlin's, young Tomlin with the soft creased photograph, Tomlin who told me to keep talking. Tomlin had jumped out of the truck and was running to Pratt under fire, and it was Tomlin's voice, breathless and high, that said, "I've got Pratt, I've got him, Doc, I need Doc." And our corpsman in the truck, Prout, was already moving. And Ray's, still pinned in the culvert with his own wounded man, came up on the net and said the thing that told me the whole shape of what was happening out there. He said, "Ironwood, who is on the gun? The gun's not firing. We need the gun. We're exposed. Who is on the gun?" The enemy in the compound, given a gap, had started shooting again. The .50 had gone silent at the exact moment it was needed most, because the man behind it was sitting up there in the open with his hands frozen on the grips, staring at what he'd done. I keyed Okonkwo, who was in the truck. "Sergeant, the gun is down. Brunner's not firing. Ray's is taking fire again. The gun is down." I will remember Okonkwo's voice on the net for the rest of my life. "Calm, always calm," he said. "Quint, talk Vasquez onto the gun. I'm getting to Brunner." So I did. Vasquez had never been the primary gunner. But I'd run 100 comms checks with Vasquez, and I knew he was steady. And I talked him up onto that gun the way you'd talk a man across a high ledge, telling him where the fire was coming from. The compound, the second floor, the windows, and Vasquez got behind the 50, and he laid into that compound and the pressure came off raise again. And this time it stayed off, and the men in the culvert got Doyle up and out and moving. And the day somehow did not become the worst day Ironwood ever had. It became the second worst. They got everyone back inside the wire by mid-afternoon. 3 wounded. Doyle, the original casualty, who lived. Pratt, the friendly fire wound, who lived too, though it took 2 surgeries and he never came back to us. And a third man, Birdie, who'd caught a fragment in the arm helping carry Pratt and wore it like a badge for the rest of the deployment. Nobody died. I need you to hear that because I've told this story to people who assume from the weight of it that somebody must have. Nobody died. And I have come to believe that the difference between nobody dying and the alternative was a handful of flat, slow words said into a radio by a person everybody in that chow tent had spent 6 weeks teaching to be quiet. I didn't feel like a hero. I want to be honest about that because the way these stories usually get told, there's a moment where the underdog stands tall and the music swells. There was no music. When the trucks came back through the gate, I came out of the ops center on legs that had turned to water, and I made it around the back of the Connex before I threw up quietly into the dirt, my whole body shaking. The flat, calm voice had cost me something. It always does. You hold it together for the people who need you to, and then when they don't need you anymore, the bill comes due and you pay it alone behind a Connex with your hands on your knees. Tomlin found me back there. He didn't say anything dumb. He just stood next to me until I was done, and then he handed me his canteen, and after a minute he said, "You kept the whole valley straight in your head. Rays, the gun, Hutchins, all of it. I don't know how you did that." "It's just the radio," I said. "No," Tomlin said, "it's not." Brunner came back through the gate a different man than the one who'd flicked my eggs into my coffee 3 hours before. I won't pretend I felt sorry for him in that moment, because I didn't, not yet. That came later, the strange unwanted pity you feel for someone you've watched fall all the way down. In the moment I just felt a cold, clean, terrible vindication, and I'm not proud of it, but I won't lie about it either. He climbed down off the truck and he didn't look at anyone. The thumbs in the vest swagger was gone like it had never existed. He walked to his Connex and he sat on the edge of his cot and he stared at the floor, and that's where they found him when the investigation started. Because there's always an investigation. A friendly fire shooting that wounds a Marine doesn't get waved off, doesn't get lost in the fog of a busy war. There were statements to take. There was the recording from the gun truck system which captured the net traffic and timestamped it, every word including the ceasefire calls and exactly how long the gun kept firing after them. There was Hutchins who'd screamed friendlies into the void. There was Vasquez who'd had to be talked onto a gun that should never have gone silent. There was Reyes asking on the record why the 50 stopped when he needed it. And there was me, the radio operator, whose calm, flat voice was on every second of that recording doing the one thing the man on the gun had failed to do, which was think. The investigating officer was a captain who flew in from battalion. He interviewed me for 2 hours. He was not unkind, but he was thorough, and at one point he leaned back and looked at me for a while and said, "Lance Corporal, I've listened to that recording 6 times. You called the ceasefire before Corporal Hutchins even finished his transmission. How did you know those were friendlies?" "I was tracking Hutchins's element on the net, sir," I said. "He'd checked in twice that morning from the overwatch. When the contact started I knew he'd moved to flank. So when the gun swung south I already had men in that direction in my head. I didn't know for certain. But the cost of being wrong about a ceasefire is a lot smaller than the cost of being wrong the other way." He wrote that down, then he said almost to himself, "That's the whole job, isn't it? Knowing which way you can afford to be wrong." I didn't understand at the time how much was riding on those 2 hours, not for me but for Brunner. The truth is the recording told the story all by itself. You could hear in cold timestamp detail, a gunner firing on unidentified movement, the ceasefire calls, the gun continuing, the long silence after when the gun should have been back in the fight and wasn't. You could hear a frightened man frozen at the worst possible moment. You couldn't hear the chow tent, the eggs, the princess jokes, the 6 weeks of small cruelties. But you didn't need to. The Valley had asked Dale Brunner its one question and his answer was on the tape. He didn't get court-martialed. I think a lot of people expect that, and it's not how it went. What happened was quieter and in its way worse. He was relieved of his position that same day. He was processed through what the Corps calls administrative action, the kind that doesn't make headlines but ends careers as surely as any verdict. He took a reduction in rank. The leadership track he'd been so sure of, the swagger he'd built his whole self on, was simply closed. A door shut in a long hallway, and within a few months he was gone, sent home, separated. One mistake. That's what people always say when they hear it. One mistake brought it all down. And it's true, but it's not the whole truth because the mistake wasn't really the gun. The mistake was a lifetime of practicing how courage looks instead of how it works. The gun was just where the bill came due for him, the way the dirt behind the connects was where it came due for me. I saw him one more time the morning he left. He was waiting for the bird, his bag at his feet, and the rest of us were doing the morning's work and pretending not to watch. He caught my eye across the dirt. For a second I thought he was going to say something cruel one last time out of pure reflex, but he didn't. He looked at me and something moved behind his face and he gave me a small nod, not friendly, not even sorry exactly, just an acknowledgement. The nod one person gives another when they both know something true that neither of them is going to say out loud. Then the bird came in over the ridge throwing grit, the same as it had thrown grit on me my first day, and he picked up his bag and was gone. I stayed at Ironwood another 4 months. I want to tell you that everything changed after that day, that the names stopped and the men carried me on their shoulders, but war isn't a movie and that's not how people work. What changed was simpler and it mattered more. When I called something on the net, they listened. When I said I saw a glint of metal on a ridge, nobody said the new girl was seeing ghosts. The radio, which had been my railing in the dark, became a thing the whole outpost trusted, and being trusted is worth more than being praised, because praise fades by dinner and trust gets you through the night. Tomlin made it home. He married the girl in the soft creased photograph. I get a card from them every December with a picture of their kids, and on the back of one of them he wrote, "Still telling people to keep talking," and I had to put it down for a minute. I think about the chow tent more than I think about the firefight. That surprises people. They expect the gun, the waddy, the wounded, but the firefight was just the question. The chow tent was the answer. Only nobody knew it yet, not Brunner with his eggs and his easy laugh, not the men who laughed along to stay on his good side, not me sitting there with my face hot, wishing I were anywhere else, learning to be small. Everything that happened in the valley that day was already there in the chow tent, written in who flicked the tray and who told the new girl to keep talking and who just looked away. The valley didn't change anyone, it only turned the lights on. So here's the thing I've carried out of all of it, the thing I'd tell you if you sat across from me with your tray. The world is full of people who will look you up and down and decide what you are before you've said a word. Some of them will be twice your size and sure of themselves and good at all the parts of the job that look good in the light. Let them. Don't argue with the chow tent. You'll never win there and it's the wrong fight anyway. Just hold on to the one thing you know how to do when the floor drops out, the one place where you know where the floor is, and keep your voice flat and your words short and keep talking, even when they tell you you're seeing ghosts. Because someday the question comes for everyone. It came for Dale Brunner at the worst possible moment behind a gun he'd bragged about for 6 weeks, and it found him hollow. It came for me 40 yards back behind a plywood wall with a handset in my hand and my eggs and my coffee, and somehow, by some grace I still don't fully understand, it found me steady. You don't get to choose when the question comes. You only get to choose in all the ordinary quiet days before it who you're becoming so that when it finally arrives, there's something there to answer it. That's the whole story. A man flicked my tray at lunch, and a few minutes later the desert asked us both what we were made of, and we both found out at the same time. He never expected the answer. Neither, if I'm honest, did I. But the radio knew. The radio had known all along.